Podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam, this is All Across America. Ralph, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mark. Pleasure to be with you.
So Ralph, you were a reporter for the New York Times from 1964 to 2009, and you served as a foreign correspondent in South Vietnam and Cambodia during the Vietnam War. You were stationed in West Germany for the New York Times. You were the Southeast Bureau Chief in Houston. You won the Pulitzer Prize as part of the team that reported on the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. And you reported most famously probably on UFOs in the Times in the 2017 article, Glowing Auras and Black Money, the Pentagon's Secret UFO Program. So you've been reporting for the Times for 60 years. Are you the longest tenured New York Times writer?
No, I'm not. No, believe it or not.
Really?
There are people who've been there longer than me. Robert McFadden, who just retired writing obits, had been a rewrite man longer than me. He started in the 50s and just retired. So I can't claim that title. It's been a long time, but it's in the record.
It sure has. It's amazing. Yeah, we were talking about this 2017 New York Times article. Really blew the lid open, began the worldwide fascination, the refascination with UFOs, and that was co-authored with Helene Cooper and Leslie Kean. What is preventing other journalists from getting into this story? Is it too big?
Well, it hasn't prevented other journalists. I mean, a lot of reporting has gone on since, not always to my liking, I must say. But I can't claim credit for breaking the story wide open in 2017. It was a kind of a watershed, but there had been reporting on UFOs before that. So, I don't want to overclaim the significance of that article. I think it did a lot of good. I think it did, show journalists that it was safe to report on UFOs. You didn't have to be a laughingstock for doing it. And a lot of, good reporting, including reporting we did, I must say, followed that article in 2017. So, but, there was reporting on it before.
And you had just said that there was some reporting that you don't care for. What about it that rubs you the wrong way?
Well, I mean, be very candid that there was recently an article in the Wall Street Journal that basically explained a lot of the sightings as disinformation by the government, and claimed to explain the whole phenomenon as deliberate efforts by the government to lead the public astray. Now, that disinformation campaign did happen, did go on. It's been going on for decades. But that does not explain the millions of sightings that remain unexplained. There is no way to explain a lot of the accounts, including abduction accounts, which remain very mysterious, that John Mack investigated, but even sightings of unidentified flying objects, or UAP as they're now called, unidentified aerial phenomena. There is just no way of saying what these things are.
And it's almost if people are explaining away a conspiracy theory that UFOs exist with another conspiracy theory that the government is conducting a so-called PSYOP, a psychological operation on the American people.
Right.
Have you found that to be the case in some instances?
Yeah, I mean, what I've been really very adamant about are the people who claim to have the answer, who claim to know that, this can all be explained by the following: sleep apnea in the case of abduction accounts, or, hypnosis, or, sublimated rape experiences. I mean, all kinds of excuses or all kinds of explanations that really don't carry water, and this is something that John Mack encountered. One by one, he knocked down all the possible explanations for what these things could be. Now, sometimes there is a legitimate explanation. Sometimes it is an aircraft. As Freud said, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. But in many cases, the phenomena defies easy explanation. There were no aircraft. No aircraft can do this, etc. It was seen in broad daylight. It didn't happen at night. I mean, all kinds of reasons that the pat explanations that the so-called skeptics, who are not really skeptics because they don't do their homework, they don't really delve in, they just jump in with an explanation that they think fits. But these encounters are truly puzzling, and I want to make that point very strongly that this is an authentic mystery. It defies explanation in every case. As I said, there are some cases that you can attach an explanation to, but not all.
I almost feel like the United States government has been willing to admit more than some journalists are willing to admit to themselves, and that the United States government has said that UFOs exist, unidentified flying objects. They haven't said what exactly their origin are. They haven't said that they're of alien origin. But do you feel like there's a lot of journalists that are unwilling to admit that?
Oh, well, that's a good point. I mean, the government has made some strides lately in the direction of candor with the American people. I think you put your finger on one of them in one of the recent reports. They did acknowledge that these things are real, which is a tremendous step forward because for many decades, really, they claimed that these are all hallucinations or fabrications. Everything except the fact that these things really exist, which they now acknowledge. These things are physical objects that we can't explain. And sometimes journalists are trying to show how independent and tough they are. I won't accept that, even that. But I think generally journalists have been more willing to accept the accounts of people who come forward. And a lot of people don't come forward. And that's another problem. People
Yeah.
are afraid of being stigmatized. They don't want to be called crazy. They're afraid of, coming out to their family or friends or the public. By the way, this is something that John Mack was quite good at. He got people to appear with him on national television and recount their experiences, often at the risk of ridicule of him and the people with these accounts. So that's another thing, but there's still a lot of stigma attached to it.
And we'll get to John Mack in your book Believer in a moment. I just wanted to finish up this thread on the New Jersey drones, and
Yeah,
even the New York Times, they had an article how drone fever spread across New Jersey and beyond, and it's almost like gaslighting the American people that what they saw really wasn't what they saw. Not saying that we don't know what these things are. People are seeing something. They could be, United States military capabilities. They could be foreign adversaries. They could be not of this earth. But to say that they didn't exist, that all of these people, including air traffic controllers, Wright Patterson Air Force Base was
right,
closed down for a time. I
right.
mean, does that not drive you crazy?
Yeah, it does drive me crazy. And first of all, even to call them drones is to put them in a category that they don't really
Right.
fit. I mean, we know what drones are. Drones are man-made objects that are used in wartime. They're used by civilians to surveil, territory. We know what a drone is. But to call these things drones is really to presuppose what they are. We don't know what they are, at least not in every case. Now, again, some of the sightings were credibly attributed later to aircraft, natural phenomena, clouds, and all kinds of birds, all kinds of things. Yes, but not in every case. And again, to call them drones is to assume, oh, we know what drones are. They're not mysterious at all. So I don't like to call them drones. Whatever flew over New Jersey in that recent wave of sightings remains unknown.
Are you, I mean, frustrated with the state of journalism right now? I mean, surveys of public trust in journalism are at an all-time low. You've been in this business, as we talked about, for 60 years.
Well, yes and no. I mean, look, every reporter thinks that, his time or her time was the golden age when they reported,
Right,
and then
right.
it's sort of gone to hell after I left. So I don't want to fall into that sort of fossil,
Yeah,
formula.
yeah.
But I know, when I was at the New York Times, we had very strict standards, very high standards. I mean, it was a different era. Of course, we wrote on typewriters for a lot of that time. Copy was handled, by physically, not digitally, etc. So certain things today do frustrate me. There's less copy editing and checking than there used to be, and I've seen standards slip. On the other hand, there's been a lot of amazing reporting coming out every day in the New York Times and other, reputable news organizations on what's happening, with the Trump administration, what's happening overseas, the atrocities being committed all over the world. So there's great reporting being done, no doubt about it. And as I tell my students when I teach journalism, the tools that are available to today's journalists far outstrip anything that we had. I mean, every person, not even journalist, every individual today is a potential journalist with a cell phone that can take pictures and videotape incidents happening all around. So you don't even have to wait for a accredited journalist to tell you what's going on. All you need is somebody with a cell phone to whip it out and say, I taped this and this encounter. Now that cuts both ways, as I tell my students. You don't know what the context is necessarily, and framed. So whatever you social media about some kind of an encounter or other, it may not be an accurate portrayal. It may be a true video, but it may be it's not a clear reflection of the circumstance. So there's a lot of questions with that. I mean, but it's true that in the old days you had to wait for a journalist to report something. Now anybody can
Right.
report anything. That's good and bad.
Sure. What is your thoughts on how the New York Times has approached the UFO UAP subject? I don't believe that you've written about it for the Times since 2020. Is that correct?
No, no, we've written about it since. I think 2021, 2022. Leslie Kane and I did a story about Blue Book. There was a program on TV that we reported on. We wrote a book. We wrote about Lou Elizondo's memoir. He's the Pentagon official who famously quit in 2017, which we reported on in that article, and has since been a major source of information on what's going on in the government. He's still restricted by confidentiality and classified his classified status oath, to uphold classified material. So he can't talk about a lot of stuff, but he talks about stuff he can talk about, and it's pretty interesting. And we wrote
Right.
about his book last year, so we've written about it since.
Right.
But you were asking about the New York Times coverage. How does the New York Times coverage, cover UFOs and UAP? Carefully, carefully, very very properly skeptical. I mean, that's okay.
Yeah.
We're used to being
Yeah.
questioned every time we write an article, not just about UFOs, but about everything I write about in the New York Times. I continue to contribute articles in the arts section and other sections, and they're always editors are always asking questions and probing your information and
As they
vetting your
should.
sources as they should, which is why the Times is really the standard of the blue ribbon standard of good journalism. Not always, they make mistakes, but I'm saying that they have still very very high standards, and other mainstream publications do too. The Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Miami Herald, Time Magazine, to the extent, and Newsweek, to the extent that they're not what they were once before, but ABC, NBC, MSNBC. So a lot of major outlets of news have high standards, and they're struggling to cope with the new realities of AI and fake news and all the things and the outpouring of news. But all in all, I think journalists are doing a good job.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of the New York Times. I'm still a subscriber. I think it's the greatest paper in the English language. However, I have had some issues with how they've covered this UFO story, particularly in regards to the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, who have been accused of withholding information illegally from the American people and congressional oversight. And they, in at least one instance, they assigned a reporter whose name I won't name, but whose beat is the Department of Defense. And I felt that there was a significant conflict of interest that you're assigning somebody whose beat is the Department of Defense to cover a story about his beat lying to the American people. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, a lot of thoughts. First of all, when you say how the Times has covered, UFOs, UAP, you should also include how the Times has not covered. I mean, there was a recent hearing in a House subcommittee House of Representatives that Times did not cover at all. I watched it, I followed it because it was live streamed, and it was not covered. So you could say that there's news out there that the Times and other mainstream media are not covering. So that's part of the problem. And again, it's good to be skeptical. It's a problem if you're too skeptical and you just question things out of rote and not accept answers. For answers being the accounts of credible people who have really no axe to grind, who are reluctantly coming forward. They're not looking to make money. If anything, they're trying to shy away from the limelight, and they are just reporting simply on what they saw, what they think happened to them, and they're the only witness. So that's part of the problem. There's no scientific verification possible because these things, for whatever reason, it's the nature of the phenomenon. And we can talk about that. I mean, that's really part of the problem, that it does not lend itself to good, rigorous scientific inquiry. On the other hand, these are witness accounts, eyewitness accounts, and we accept eyewitness testimony in a court of law. People have been sentenced to death based on eyewitness testimony. And suddenly, when it comes to UFOs, we don't accept it. Well, there's no scientific proof. Well, in certain cases of criminal procedure, there's no other evidence other than a witness's testimony. But anyway, so that's a long a long roundabout answer to your question about what the problem is.
You had published probably the most sensational line in New York Times history. It was a quote by astrophysicist Eric W. Davis. And he said he gave a classified briefing to a Defense Department agency as recently as March about retrievals from off world vehicles not made on this Earth. Have you spoken to, either on background, off the record, with firsthand witnesses for the United States government and other defense contractors who have said that they themselves have seen a UFO or a non-human so-called biologic?
Yes, to answer your question directly, we have. And Leslie and I have talked to a lot of people. We don't always write about it because it doesn't reach the standard of proof and disclosure that we require, and that the New York Times requires, particularly in terms of named sources. And we're pretty, insistent on quoting named sources and not anonymous sources because they don't carry the same weight. And the one thing we're proudest of in our 2017 article and our subsequent reporting, especially for the Times, is that it was all on the record. We didn't have unnamed sources that you can't verify. We quoted top intelligence people with their names and their credentials, their bona fides, so people know whether to trust them or not. So to answer your question, yes, we've gotten many accounts from people who say who claim to be in the know. They have intelligence credentials. They say they have seen craft with their own eyes. They put their hands on craft. They have, in some cases, seen alien bodies, but not to the point where we can verify that information. So we don't report on it. In some cases, we find them credible. In other cases, we cannot assess their credibility because we lack certain evidence. Now, in the case of the military experts that we like to quote, we do find them credible because we have their credibility on record. We have the awards they've won, their military record, which is why we like to quote military experts and people in the government and Pentagon officials more than we like to quote random people, because the Pentagon people and the pilots, for example, who we've quoted, have a proven record of credibility. I mean, the government would not entrust mentally unstable people with multi-million-dollar equipment to fly, these fighter jets. So people like Dave Fravor, have a built-in credibility, yes, but we assess everyone's credibility separately. So before we'll take anyone's account, like David Grush, who was a witness before Congress, who had a very sensational account of work he did on UAP and things he says he knew about UAP, including, he says, alien bodies, that it's, again, he didn't have the proof, physical proof of these bodies, but he says that they were found, that they existed in wreckage of UFOs. And given his record of credibility in the military, his statements ought to be taken seriously, we found. So that's the answer. We check out everybody we quote, and certain people who we do quote have very high levels of credibility.
Do you think the United States government or defense contractors is in possession of craft not of this earth?
We have been told that. So yes, I think the accounts are credible. One of the problems is that the Freedom of Information Act, which allows journalists and the public to request government records, does not apply to private corporations. So I can't go to Lockheed and say, can you disclose this and this record about a supposed, UFO that you retrieved or that you've been given possession of. I can make that request of the government, not always, successfully, but at least they are the Freedom of Information Law, FOIA, does apply to the government. It doesn't apply to private industry. So I've collected a lot of accounts that companies, aerospace companies, are the ultimate repository of some of this off-world material, but you cannot confirm it. You cannot prove it.
And is that done by design that they can't be FOIA'd?
Probably. I mean, the Defense Department has a very close working relationship with certain defense contractors for obvious reasons. The Pentagon contracts with contractors for aircraft, for surveillance systems, for things that private industry does all the time. So there is this interchange between the government and private industry, and whether it's done deliberately to hide information about these craft, the effect is the same, that this information is not accessible to the public. And members of Congress have said publicly that they try to get access to industry that supposedly has information about these kind of things, and are blocked.
There have been reports of journalists working for the intelligence community that have been embedded in mainstream media outlets. Do you think that that has been the case and is still the case in some respects?
I have not run across that. I must say, I mean, during the Vietnam War that I covered, there were definitely, first of all, it was a different world then, and there was much closer cooperation between military intelligence and the media, for better or worse. I mean, I'm not defending it. That was just the way things were. And there were people going around as journalists at that time who had some kind of relationship with the government. Let's put it that way. That they were either implanted masquerading as journalists. I mean, that did happen. And journalists who were legitimate journalists did have relationships with government spooks exchanging information. That happened too. So, but I'm not aware of that going on today.
Now, there was a leak on David Grush where it was considered to be some sort of retaliatory mechanism that his personal, I guess there were police files were released, that there was some sort of domestic incident, and that was written about. It almost seemed like that story was planted with a certain reporter. What were your thoughts on that incident? Maybe we can talk a little bit longer about David Grush.
Yeah. Well, the whistleblowers like Dave Grush have been subject to terrible retaliation. They have reported that officially. It's under official investigation. We've reported that. We've heard it from many of our sources. It is a terrible problem, and that's really the reason a lot of whistleblowers are afraid to come forward. And there've even been reports of people being killed. Dave Grush, I think, testified to that before Congress. So that's not just plain rumor. That is a testimony to Congress, and it's credible accounts to us. So we've heard that many times, and I think it's shameful. There is a law now on the books that says whistleblowers have to be protected, and they are supposed to be immune from retaliation if they report their information through the proper channels. I mean, the whistleblower statute prescribes in detail how they can provide their information. It doesn't mean they can just, you know, make an announcement about what they know of classified information. They have to do it in a certain forum, in a certain way. But if they do it that way to, let's say, qualified members of Congress, they ought to be protected. Well, that hasn't happened very often the way it's supposed to happen. They have been retaliated against, these whistleblowers, and Lou Elizondo, the former head of the Pentagon UFO office, has talked about that publicly. Again, that's not covered by classified restrictions, and he's talked about how he was retaliated against, and Grush has talked about that. So that's a fact as far as I'm concerned.
And just for our audience, who is David Grush?
Dave Grush is a former intelligence operative who came forward 2 years ago or so, testified before Congress on what he knew. He said that there is a war going on, a competition between Russia and China and the US and other powers to develop, back engineer, reverse engineer UFO technology, which is quite a sensational claim that all these countries have had access to craft, and they are working feverishly to harvest that technology, including the US. That's quite an interesting claim. He also claimed that UFOs have crashed, that the US and other powers have retrieved material from these, and in some cases have seen alien bodies in the wreckage. That's not a claim we reported on because that was just a little too difficult to verify, but other information that he provided us that we were able to the extent we were able to check it out, we were able to report on it. So Rush is probably the most important intelligence witness so far before Congress, and he has offered to make his information available in restricted form to Congress. Now, Congress has been lied to. We know that. Members have said that over the years. Congress, which is supposed to have an oversight role and is supposed to approve budgets and funding, has been shut out of the system. And work has gone on behind the back of Congress. Members of Congress have been denied information. It's been withheld from Congress improperly, perhaps illegally, according to the charges that have been made officially. So there's a whole history of this.
Why isn't this a bigger story, both among journalists and amongst members of Congress? I mean, it is the very essence of representative democracy. And whether or not the UFO piece turns out to be true, it seems to be pretty much verified that the Department of Defense is lying to Congress. Why is that not a bigger story?
Yeah, that's almost a rhetorical question. You're absolutely right. Why isn't it a bigger story? Now, it has been covered. It's been covered. I mean, there've been hearings before Congress where that charge has been officially made. So it is on the record. It's in the congressional record. It's been stated publicly. It's on C-SPAN. So it's not that it's been totally covered up. That charge has been made. And I guess if you look at the trajectory of the whole story, the issue, it's now much better known than it was in years past.
Yeah.
What information has been withheld from Congress. And for the first time now, in recent years, Congress has stepped up and started holding hearings. I mean, there've been a bunch of them, in the last 2 or 3 years. So, in that sense, it's definite progress.
I did see something in regards to one of the hearings. It was an opinion piece. It was in the Washington Post, and the author of the story, this was it was either the David Fravor hearings or the Grush hearings, had said, and this was actually the first hearings with David Fravor, the Commander David Fravor, Navy fighter pilot, and had accused that it was Republicans only that were in the hearing. And of course, AOC asked a number of questions, as did a number of other Democratic legislators. And I almost felt like it was lying by omission. And so this person was trying to paint the idea of a conspiracy theory, but not using correct information.
Well, there's a lot in your question, Mark. First of all, a lot of this issue has been carried by conservative Republicans, MAGA Republicans. That seems to be the case. Tim Burchett of Tennessee, Congresswoman Luna, who recently chaired the House hearings. And there's been a political edge to some of these hearings to the extent that they've said the government the government has withheld information. The administrations, plural, have withheld information from the public. So there is a political dimension to this. But the hearings, I mean, the members of the committees are bipartisan. The Democrats and Republicans both have asked questions. So I think it is a bipartisan issue, but to the extent that it's been carried more by conservative Republicans, I think that's undeniable.
You reported extensively on the mafia. Are there a lot of correlations to you between the mafia and this issue?
I don't know about a lot, but some. The idea of powerful people with abusing the system. Yes, I see some parallels there. And, I want to make this point too, Mark, that, my UFO coverage has drawn some, particular attention because it's unusual for a Times reporter to be, writing books and doing podcasts about UFOs. But as far as I'm concerned, it's just another good story. And I like to think I apply the same standards of verification and fact checking to UFO stories that I do to mafia stories or political stories or corruption stories or anything else I write about. A journalist is a journalist, and I got into this because I saw an issue that really cried out for coverage, and the public should know about it. I mean, this is, by the way, an issue that the public should not be shielded from, or information that the public should not be shielded from. It's the ultimate issue for all of humanity. I mean, are we alone? What are these objects? Have we been visited by, unearthly intelligence? Has the government covered up these contacts? I mean, all these questions are the province of all of humanity, not just Americans, but everybody. And I mean, if there's a question that's more important to the to all of humanity, I don't know what it is. I mean, what's going on in the universe? Are we alone or not alone? And that's not a national security issue, it seems to me. The government, can claim that it's withholding certain information on national security grounds. If these craft indeed exist, let's say, well, how do they work? And can we harness that technology for our own defense to say, okay, well, that might be a matter of state secrecy that we have figured out how this technology works, how our enemies may be trying to use it against us, how we can use it to defend ourselves. So you can say, well, exactly how that technology may work, that's a national security question. But the fact that it exists and that these objects are, visiting from some dimension or some part of space that we don't understand, that doesn't seem to me to be much of a national security question. The government has treated it that way and said, you people can't know about this because this is too scary. And if you know about this, then you won't trust us anymore to protect you. That's why the government has been, withholding information.
You've been researching this topic, I guess, for coming on 20 years after I believe your origin story was you found a book, Passport to the Cosmos, at a bookstore in Houston, Texas, and that got you into researching John Mack. Do you feel like you've just scratched the surface of the phenomenon? It just seems so large and so big and
Yeah,
ever
no
expanding.
question. No question. The more you think you know about this, the less you really know. I mean, that's clear. And again, this is my quarrel with the so-called skeptics who are not really skeptics, they're debunkers. Because if they were really skeptics, they'd want to absorb all the information that's out there and then figure out, well, what's not right about that information. I mean, clearly, you can the field is open to skepticism and attack. Some accounts are not reliable. Clearly, there have been people who have fabricated information. So there is room for skepticism, to be sure. But the people who have been touted as skeptics, and I've experienced this myself with my reporting, they just throw out absurd explanations for things that can't be explained. So that's really the problem. I forgot how we got what button.
John
I,
Mack and the
yeah.
believer. And can you tell us who John Mack is and a little bit about your book?
So as you said, Mark, I picked up this book when I was in New York Times correspondent in Texas. It's called Passport to the Cosmos, and it was by a Harvard psychiatrist, the head of the psychiatry department at Harvard, who was very trustworthy in his field. I mean, he was quite a luminary in the field of psychiatry, and suddenly he's interested in abduction accounts of people who, come to him saying they were taken by aliens and they had these experiences and all that. And he took the accounts seriously enough to investigate them. And I thought, well, that's interesting. That's kind of courageous for a Harvard psychiatrist. And he did get into trouble because of it, because Harvard then investigated him. Anyway, that's what started me off. As I said, it was a legitimate journalistic inquiry. Who was this Harvard psychiatrist, a, a laureled member of the faculty of our, preeminent higher education institution? And that's what started me off. So that's who John Mack was, and he was comfortable enough financially and socially to not to be intimidated. And he decided to investigate this, as he and others have said, disreputable field. And so that's what got me interested.
And he what he said, which was most fascinating to me, was that whatever was happening to these so-called abductees, these experiencers, they believed what was happening to them was real.
Yeah. And it didn't fit any of the normal explanations. For example, the most common explanation was, well, this is a nightmare. Okay. You've suffered a nightmare. Well, first of all, a lot of these, quite a number of these encounters did not happen at night. It happened in broad daylight. People would be out driving, or they'd be, in one case, on a snowmobile, all kinds of experiences in the daytime. And people, and by the way, John Mack studied nightmares as a psychiatrist. He wrote a book on nightmares, and so he knew what nightmares were. And people who said, "Oh, you're confusing this with a nightmare," he said, "Look, I'm an expert in nightmares. I have studied nightmares. These are not, at least they're not normal nightmares. There's some kind of an experience that happens sometimes at night, but they're not what we would consider nightmares. In other words, constructions thrown up by our mental activity. There was some physical component to these encounters, and in some cases, physical evidence left behind, like marks on the body or disruptions in the environment that seem to, and in some cases, multiple witnesses having the same report of some, UFO descending before the abduction. So that doesn't, unless two people are having the exact same nightmare at the same time, which does not seem likely, the nightmare scenario doesn't fit. So that's why he was such a good investigator of this phenomenon. He was brave, he was knowledgeable, he was authoritative, and he was pretty open minded about it. He was a little too enthusiastic, which is what I say in my book. And he was slapped on the wrist for that. Harvard, when they investigated him, found nothing really wrong with anything he did, but just that he threw himself into it a little too enthusiastically. He could have been a little more careful, a little more distant. But the things he found remain mysterious.
Do you think there was some jealousy in this so-called Inquisition in that he appeared on Oprah? He got a lot of notoriety for it, almost that he became too big for his boots?
No question. You know that academia does not suffer success in your comrades. If they succeed in something, there's always going to be people who are trying to beat you down. He also won a Pulitzer Prize, by the way. He wrote a book about Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, that really broke new ground in terms of psychological insight. Lawrence was a very charismatic and complicated figure in British history. He rallied the Arab, peasants, the Arab street, really against the colonial governments. and just at the height of his power, he sort of stepped back. He was a very strange character who did not like the sight of blood, and yet inflicted a lot of blood spillage in his rebellion, leading the Arab tribes. But 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 Mack jumped into this. He saw parallels with himself and Lawrence, to be sure, in terms of well-to-do people who immerse themselves in public controversy. But it was a marvelous book. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 1974, 75, or whatever. And his colleagues would never forgive him for that.
And his approach to this so-called alien abduction phenomenon, did he not believe that it wasn't as simple as some beings coming from some far-off planet, the so-called Zeta Reticuli, to abduct humans? He thought it was more of another dimension. What was his rationale?
Yeah. Well, he started off, as I said, these people came to him, patients and others. He never could figure out, were they research subject, were they patients? Because they weren't really suffering from anything except this experience. But anyway, I forgot what I was going to say about this, but
Dimensions.
how he but the way they described the encounters to him, and they often relived it when they were talking to him. And by the way, he didn't really believe in hypnosis, although he was trained in it. Unlike other people who dabbled in hypnosis, he was trained to do hypnosis. He didn't really like hypnosis. He rather just relaxed people so that they could talk about what they thought they remembered. Okay. And when they recounted these experiences they had, they were so intense and they were so terrified by what they told him they remembered. Okay, that he thought they were not making it up. Now, he said, I'm a psychiatrist. I know when people are fabricating or hallucinating or lying. And these people, whatever the truth of the encounter, are not lying. So anyway, in the beginning, he took it very much at face value. These people were abducted by aliens who came off a spaceship, who beamed these people up into the spaceship, and he found no other explanation for what they had endured, and it was very vivid in their minds. And he said, "This is exactly what happened." So, another people off the street or out of their beds, other people, like let's say the spouse sleeping alongside them, are turned off somehow, and they don't experience, they don't see, they're not a witness. So this can't be happening. Oh, it's got to be happening some, as he said, liminal, some borderline state that's partly true and partly other dimensional. Now, this got him into conflict with other people like Bud Hopkins, who was an artist, who was not a psychiatrist, but who was investigating these stories before John Mack got into the picture. And he actually did hypnotize people, Bud Hopkins, and he came away, and David Jacobs, another academic who studied this, they came away saying, this is happening just exactly like the people are telling it.
Yeah.
It's happening in reality. And these aliens are coming down and abducting people and taking their sperm and eggs for a hybrid race, and that's what's happening. This is a danger to humanity. Mack wasn't so sure. And to his credit, I think he imbued it with more of the mystery that it is.
Yeah.
It's not happening in a daily reality where we see people being abducted. Clearly, it's happening under very special circumstances. Not everybody is witnessing this. So this is what troubled Mack. So he moved away from the literal explanation. And by the way, he then related these experiences more and more to other supernatural experiences, life after death, precognition, knowing things before they happen, all these other things, that remote viewing where people have been able to talk about things happening thousands of miles away and visualizing something that seems not explainable any other way. So Max saw a whole bunch of things that seem to defy our understanding. And he said maybe this is related to that. Anyway, that's a long answer to your question whether these things whether Mac believed they were literal or not.
Do you think consciousness is a connected to the UFO phenomenon?
I do. I think that there are things we don't understand about consciousness, and there are scientists. Gary Nolan at Stanford, by the way, is probably the best known example of somebody who is studying consciousness to understand the abilities of the human mind to go beyond the blood and guts part of the brain to figure out what powers are inherent in consciousness. I mean, can we move things with our mind, for example, which is one area of scientific inquiry that has been, discussed in the literature. So consciousness is can we extend our consciousness to connect with other things, outside the body? There are a lot of questions about what powers of consciousness there are, and so I believe there's a lot left unexplained and a lot we have yet to learn.
Wanted to turn to after disclosure, and we were talking that before we started recording that I have two young children. You have a young grandson, and you and your wife Debbie wrote a book called UFOs. Can you talk a little bit about that and why you wrote it?
She heard me, doing all these interviews for my book on John Mack, and she came up with the idea of a book for children because children have no understanding of, how to, approach this whole UFO thing. They see cartoons on TV, the movies, and there's a lot of UFO stuff in the atmosphere, in the literature and movies, but kids don't know how to take it. So we thought, well, there's room for a book, it's a nonfiction book. It's not fiction at all. Of what we know, strictly based on what is known, and it's a true story actually that I came up with in my research and he's in my book on John Mack, a kid who was playing tennis in Florida years ago, and he sees a UFO above the tennis court, and adults playing there see it too. And the kid does not know how to explain this. It's clearly a UFO, some kind of spaceship above the tennis court. And he asks the adults there, "What is that?" And they said, "Well, we don't know." And he runs home and he tells his mother, "We saw a UFO." So it starts off with that. And then it tells the story of other sightings and the fact that for many, many years, objects have been seen that can't be explained. And that's basically where the book starts and ends. It doesn't talk about aliens. It doesn't talk about, I mean, it talks about Roswell, where there was a crash of something
Yeah.
in 1947. It remains very mysterious because the government completely screwed it up to the point where nobody to this day can really easily figure out what happened. First, the government said a UFO crash. Then it said, oh, no, it wasn't a UFO, it was a weather balloon. But other people then came forward and said, no, that doesn't, they brought in the weather balloon later. It doesn't explain what really happened. So we do talk about that because that's an established fact
Yeah.
that something happened at Roswell, and the government was very mysterious about it.
Oh yes.
But that's the extent to which we talk about things that are not proven. The other sightings we say, are all verified. Things have been seen in the sky. Nobody knows what they are, and it remains to be figured out. It's a mystery.
Yeah.
We begin and end with that. It's a mystery.
Yeah.
It's beautifully illustrated, by the way, by an artist who illustrated one of Debbie's other books on a lost dog. So we love the art that he did. And by the way, he got the great idea of depicting some of these UFOs, spaceships, from above, looking down on them, which is kind of interesting. So you see them from different points of view, and they were all described over the years in the same way. They're round with windows, and you know, so it's a mystery.
And it's one that the next generation will inherit.
Absolutely, and they will know more, by the way, because information is increasing. We now know more thanks to courageous members of Congress. We know more than we knew before, and the government just can't get away with saying, "Oh, this is nonsense. You're crazy." Now there are hearings in Congress. There are whistleblowers. People are coming forward. It's a slow process, but the next generation will have more information available to them.
So to come full circle in our conversation, after disclosure, what happens to journalism?
Well, we'll go on to other things. I mean, first of all, disclosure is the word du jour about, the government. It's kind of fanciful that the government will sit down and tell you what really happened, disclose all the secret files. That ain't going to happen because there's a lot of national security stuff involved here and this technology that they don't want other people to know about. So it's not going to happen as easily as, one might wish or some people are wishing. But journalism will go on. There are other mysteries. Is there a God? How did the universe start? Are we in a an imagined universe or a physical universe? How old is the universe? I just saw something, by the way. Physics obviously keeps changing, and we learn more and more. But I just saw something the other day on the internet that the universe is supposedly 13.9 billion years old. That's the Big Bang that started it all off somehow. But there's some gases and particles or building blocks of matter that go back trillions of years. So if they go back trillions of years, how could they go back before the Big Bang, before there was a universe? So that's another of the mysteries that scientists are grappling with. And if there was a Big Bang, well, what did it bang out of? uh, you know, so obviously these questions are fascinating, and they're not going to be easily resolved. We're only a few thousand years old as a technological civilization, maybe younger, maybe hundreds of years old. I mean, the Industrial Revolution happened in the 1800s. So what will science progress to over the next hundreds and thousands of years, assuming humanity can last that long, doesn't blow itself up? But so there's a lot, and you think of the strides we made now, the cameras that go back. I have on my website a picture of a black hole that is, I forgot how many millions of light years away, 50, I forgot the exact number, 50 million light years away. And an image was captured by scientists, astronomers. When you think of it, amazing. It was an image put together. It's not actually a picture. It's not a photograph, but it's a picture put together from the data. So if we can do that, if these telescopes can capture, the beginnings of the universe. What remain? What great findings yet are yet to be made? I mean, they still don't know what the building blocks of the universe are. Dark matter and dark energy are largely unknown. So that's a mystery that could be solved in coming decades or centuries. So disclosure is a moving target.
You mentioned a website. How can people find out more about you, Ralph? And what are you working on next?
Oh, well, my website is ralphblumenthal.com. It talks a lot about John Mack and the book. It has all my articles and coverage and biography, etc. I haven't hit on another big book project. The last book took me 17 years, the John Mack book. I don't know if I'm up for that again. And book series take longer. I've written about the mafia. I've written about the Stork Club. I've written about undercover detectives, and so I don't know what is going to cross my radar next. But so far I like writing newspaper pieces. I continue to contribute to the New York Times. I write arts pieces. I wrote about a big mural of M.C. Wyeth, the great family of painters in Pennsylvania and Maryland, and so I don't know. I'll have to look, but I'm going to stick with reporting on UFOs for the foreseeable future. It's a
Excellent.
great field.
It sure is. Well, Ralph Blumenthal, author of The Believer, Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and The Passion of John Mack, and UFOs with his wife, Debbie Blumenthal. Ralph, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for being on the show.
Mark, it's always great talking to you. Thank you for having me.
Same here. All Across America is produced by me, Marco Vig, in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Visit us on Instagram at All Across America. Check out our website, allacrossamerica.com. There's an interactive map with all our episodes, and there's a Contact Us page where you can send your reactions, guest ideas, and suggestions. So get in touch, stay connected. To me, that's what podcasting is all about. Thanks for listening.